Constitutions are basically the core principles or axioms of a country that guide every decision like a moral compass, but in law form. Let's understand the world a little better. I'm your host, Timo Wunderlich, and with me is Donald L. Horowitz, professor of law and political science at Duke University. He has studied the creation of constitutions, particularly in societies divided by ethnic conflict, for decades. He also wrote a book about the topic called Constitutional Processes and Democratic Commitment. It will be linked down in the description. I've brought a quote with me from Tom Ginsburg and Ezek Hug that says, of the 964 constitutions promulgated during the last 2 centuries, only 406 remained in force for more than a decade. That's not a lot. Donald, what do you think? What are the main reasons constitutions fail?
Well, I'm not sure anyone knows the main reasons in the sense that anyone has disentangled all of those cases, of course. But I think for the most part, the constitution making process can be quite sloppy for reasons I can explain. But in addition to that, the constitutions tend to disappoint people after they're put into effect. People think they're going to benefit in some way, and they don't benefit. Or a new regime comes to power, and it thinks that the Constitution isn't in its interest. But there are many, many reasons why constitutions can fail. Uh, there are, however, only a few reasons why they can succeed, and it's probably more fruitful to talk about that. But it's definitely the case. Ginsburg and his colleagues, Elkins and another person, did show that the durability of constitutions is really quite limited. There's another reason why, before we move on, there is another reason why constitutions fail, and that is that they're always made by amateurs. That is to say, people who make constitutions have never made a constitution before, and they will never make one again. So even if they acquire some wisdom in the course of making a constitution, they won't pass that wisdom down to the next generation because their job is done. They occasionally write some memoir, which will be a self-serving document designed to show that they did a good job, but it won't really tell people what problems they encountered, and it won't really be terribly informative. And so it's a good thing that we have a bunch of scholars who are working on this. I'm only one among many scholars working on constitution making.
Let me then quickly ask you. I think I read this, but I wasn't able to find it again. Um, have you consulted constitution makers in the process?
Yes, many times actually.
Many
Once
times. So there are consultants that did beforehand actually have experience with the constitution process.
Yes, but it's a very mixed bag of consultants. A lot of them are accidental. I was accidental the first time. I happened to be in Nigeria at the time a constituent assembly was sitting to draft a constitution. And I was giving lectures, and my lectures were very widely publicized for reasons I'm not sure I can explain. But I must tell you that I think probably the lecture that I gave that had the widest attendance was in my whole career was in Nigeria, where I spoke about military coups as the military was leaving power to an audience of about 450 people at the University of Lagos. And I was very fearful about that. I thought that perhaps the military would either cut me off or I'd have hostile questions. But in fact, the public was really interested in what I had to say because they wanted the military to get out of power and get back to civilian rule. Anyway, that's a side issue. As it happened, because my lectures were widely publicized, I was visited by one of the delegations at the Constituent Assembly. They asked to make an appointment with me, and we made an appointment. Unfortunately, the air conditioning failed, and Lagos is a very hot city. So we sweated and sweated for several hours while discussing one provision, which has proved to be a very durable provision in the Nigerian constitution and a very useful one, too. The delegation, was ethnically composed. That is, one ethnic group was among many, and a rather large ethnic group among many was in that delegation. And they said to me, "Look, last time we've been victims of a lot of violence, a lot of ethnic violence, and we want to try and prevent the government from being biased in favor of one group or another." And a different delegation has proposed the following provision to elect the president. I said, "What is it?" The provision requires that to be elected president, the person who is a candidate must have a plurality of votes, the largest number of votes, plus a second set of requirements, not less than 25% of the vote in no fewer than two-thirds of the states. There were then, I think, 14 states, 16 states. I can't remember. There are now 36 states in Nigeria. And I said, what do you think of that? I said, well, it's obvious that because ethnic groups cluster by states, states are a proxy for ethnicity, and they want widely distributed ethnic support for the winning candidate for president. I think this is a great idea. Let's look in a little more detail about how it might work out. And after a couple of hours, we said, this doesn't seem to have any very big problems. In fact, one big problem did occur in the first election under it. But after that, it's gone very, very smoothly. All candidates in Nigeria who have won have managed to secure both of those requirements, including what we call now territorial distribution. Subsequently, what was that, 30 years later, approximately, or thereabouts, 30, no, 20 some years later, I was in Indonesia. By the way, I've also written a book on Indonesia's constitutional formation. And while I was in Indonesia, I went to a meeting of parliamentarians at which an interest group was proposing that they adopt the Nigerian version. And they did adopt it in Nigeria, but they changed the terms of it to make it a little easier for the president to win. And no president has failed to secure territorial distribution in Indonesia, but because the requirements are easier. So it's a less effective provision in Indonesia, but very effective in Nigeria because the presidents really have to think about the base of their support and widening it.
In the case of Nigeria, or in general, do you know why they, for example, chose you as a consultant, or in
Nigeria,
general,
yeah, yes.
the people that were involved in the process, why they get chosen?
Well, the people is a lot of different people, but I can tell you first why I get chosen. Because I know something about ethnically divided countries, and now I have a reputation for writing about constitution making that goes back to that original encounter. But I've also consulted in quite a few other countries, usually on a particular matter. For example, in Afghanistan, I didn't go to Afghanistan, but I consulted long distance on a provision for judicial review in Afghanistan that the foreign advisors were very wary of, and for good reason, actually. And I wrote a memorandum that I think dissuaded some people from adopting what the most radical provisions for judicial review would be. Judicial review for constitutionality, I mean. In other countries, well, it just varies. In Fiji, for example, I was a consultant on what electoral system to adopt. And I succeeded in convincing the commission to adopt it. And then it was mucked up by a parliamentary select committee, which then proceeded to eliminate one of the requirements, and the elections didn't turn out the way they ought to have turned out. So you have to be wary that your work as a consultant can be undone in subsequent iterations of the same phenomenon. Um, Now, who were the others? Well, early on, after the end of communism in Eastern Europe, the American Bar Association sent out a lot of people, um, but they only knew about American constitution making. So they tended to advise people to adopt the American Constitution, more or less, one way or another, which is silly. The American Constitution was designed for the peculiar circumstances of the United States. And let's say Bulgaria doesn't have those circumstances, or Romania or Poland. And fortunately, the influence of the American Bar Association people was limited. They really were extremely parochial. You don't want to send out people who only know their own country. You'd better know something about the country you're advising in. And luckily for me, I've been working on ethnic conflict around the world. So just as a byproduct of that, I happen to know, I'm not bragging about this, I just happen to know something about pretty much all the countries that might want to consult with me because they tend to be ethnically divided. So that's my story, but there are many other stories. And there are some organizations now that make it their business to go around advising on constitution making. But I want to tell you some more bad news. um, their advice tends to be rather homogeneous, and it's not directed at the process of constitution making itself. It's directed at an aspect of constitution making that really they advise should precede the process of constitution making. And it's the only prescription they have, by the way. They don't care how you make the Constitution as long as you do what they say is essential, and that is engage the public in an exercise of public participation in which members of the Constitution making body go out into the country, their own country, you understand, in order to find out what people would like to have in the Constitution. They then, of course, activate many different interest groups who submit thousands of memoranda, most of which there's no time to read or process thoroughly or correctly. But they also enable some extremists to make their views felt in a rather extreme way, um, which is not a very good thing. It challenges the integrity of the process if when it happens. If it doesn't always happen, but it sometimes does. And if you ask individuals engaged in the process, we have studies of not in the process, in the pre-process political engagement of the public. If you ask people who are consulted, what would you like to see in the Constitution? They say, I don't know. That's the business of the Constitution makers. I don't have any expertise in this. They always say that's for experts to decide. That's why we have a Constitution making body. And despite that, the people who are interested in public participation persist in making that the sine qua non, the essential aspect of a democratic, legitimate constitution. Whereas, in fact, it's not. The central aspect of a democratic, legitimate constitution is that it's been carefully considered, that it's apt for the circumstances in which it is to be working, and that it be democratic rather than contain some undemocratic provisions, which some unfortunately do. So that's, and by the way, let me say one more thing about public participation. I'm not against public participation, but I'm against this kind of this wide ranging survey that goes on in advance of the actual process. It's much better to consult the public when you have a product to sell and you want to
Mm.
ask, does this product look good to you? Uh, and when people can look at it and examine it, and experts can say, yes, it looks pretty good to me. We didn't make it, but it looks pretty good to me. Um, uh, and the public can also rely on their own experts. But in advance, what do you want in the Constitution? I don't know. I mean, even I wouldn't know. If you asked me, what do I want in a new American Constitution? I'd have to think about this for long and hard because it's an abstract question. It's crazy. But I'm telling you that there are interest groups out there whose business is supposed to be constitution making, and that is the most important thing on their agenda, which strikes me as very odd.
Back to the question I asked prior, how you came to be involved in the process. Who actually invited you there then?
Where? To Nigeria?
Let's say to Nigeria. Yeah.
Oh, I was giving talks for the U.S. State Department. They had a program taking academics who had overseas engagements and saying, "Would you like to give a few lectures? It's up to you what you talk about. Discuss it with your hosts. We'll arrange the contacts between you and your hosts." I don't know if that program is still in existence. That was that time. Another time in Fiji, it's because I became well known for advocating a certain kind of electoral system in an ethnically divided country, and the commission wanted to hear my views on it. Actually, that was through the UN. I got a call one day saying that the commission, which consisted of a Fijian member, an Indo-Fijian member, and a chairperson from New Zealand, and also a staff director from New Zealand, were going to be in North Carolina and would come down to Duke to see me if I were available. It turned out the dates they had were all dates on which I had a very heavy teaching schedule, and I said I wouldn't be available on those days. They said, "Well, that's too bad. The commission is going back to New Zealand." I said, "Oh." The commission is going back to New Zealand. As it happens, I'm spending next semester in New Zealand, and I can meet the commission there anytime it wants to. So I met the commission in New Zealand, and after a couple of sessions discussing the electoral system, which is really what they wanted to know about, uh, they thought my ideas were pretty good. They have subsequently agreed with me, by the way, that the problem with the electoral system that was ultimately adopted is that the Parliamentary Select Committee that was reviewing the Constitution had changed some of the crucial terms and made the system much less effective than it was. So that's that one. I can think of Afghanistan again. Um, they knew that I knew something about judicial review. They contacted me because they suspected that what I would write, and they were correct about what I would write, giving them some basis for hesitation about it. I mean, I could go into a lot of others. In Indonesia, I have a heavy background in Malaysia and Indonesia, and I was asked by the National Democratic Institute if I would go out there and have a careful look at what was going on, and perhaps contribute a few ideas, which I did. And then, of course, I got so fascinated with it, I made 4 other trips, and I followed with interviews with all the constitution makers and produced that other book, which is called what is it called? Constitutional. I can't remember it, but the name of the title of the book, but it's around.
So interesting. So in some cases, they specifically ask for you as a consultant, and in other cases, the not the U.S. government, but a body within the U.S. government
No,
has
not within the
selected
U.S.
you.
government. No, always a body with the exception of that one time in Nigeria. Um,
That's
uh,
what I meant.
Always a body connected to the recipient state. Always a
Okay.
body
Okay.
connected with well, NDI is not the U.S. government, actually. It's a non-governmental organization, but it's an American one. Okay, but it knew that I had connections to Indonesia previously. It knew that I have a very heavy background in Malaysia next door, so that's why they did it. In Fiji, it was definitely the Fijian Commission itself. Let me think of some others. In Afghanistan, it was advisors to the Afghan body that was going to make the constitution. But
But they did ask for you.
oh yeah,
The
by name.
country.
Yes, yes, absolutely. They contacted me directly.
Okay.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Interesting.
Virtually always it happens that way.
I would like to go to the whole process, if that is possible. Do you know what the main reason, or typically the reason why a new constitution is formed and an old constitution is rejected is? Is it through war, or is there what is the typical?
Some form of
Um,
discontent is usually the typical reason. And it can be political discontent by a party disadvantaged by the Constitution. Sometimes, as in Chile's recent one, it's left-right disputes, and they wanted a more left Constitution, and they got a very heavily left Constitution, which the Parliament didn't like, and so they then got a different Constitution, which tilts a little bit to the right. It can be any number of reasons, but the underlying reason. Let me tell you what the underlying reason is. The underlying reason is that there's very little wisdom about how constitutions should be formed, and therefore a lot of mistakes that can be made in the process of forming them. So let me put it bluntly: people who are making constitutions will never have made one before and will never make one again. Under those circumstances, there's very little wisdom that's passed down from one generation to another. And so the recorded knowledge, until relatively recently, the recorded knowledge was limited to a handful of cases, including most notably the American case of 1787. Um, but in the recent years, there's been a proliferation of accounts, not just by me, but by many other people, of constitution making. And that's useful. There is a literature one can draw upon that goes way beyond whether there should be public participation. If you read the literature, you can see what went wrong in any individual case, and you could form a theory of what went wrong, and you might form a theory of how to make it right. That's the basis of my book. I took a very intensive look at 7 or 8 such constitutions, 3 of which had been formed in one way, and 4 or 5 of which had been formed in rather different ways. And I think the 3 that were formed in one way were much better than the 4 or 5 that were formed in other ways. And I can tell you in detail what the characteristics of each category are in that score.
I would still like to go along this process. If we start with problems in the country, then advisors typically get called upon, and can you help us find a new constitution by, I would assume, a new government, probably, because the old government probably isn't there anymore since of the problems that arose. People probably wouldn't want to have them around, I would assume.
Yes, it's sometimes at a critical transition. That's right. Usually a transition to democracy from authoritarianism. If you ask for the most common case, maybe it's not the majority, but the most common case, it's at a time of transition generally speaking, from authoritarianism to democracy. That's right. So that's the way it was in Tunisia after the Arab Spring. That's the way it was in Indonesia after Suharto was overthrown in 1998. Um, the Some other cases, though, involve, well, in Sri Lanka, for example, when they made a constitution, it was because the previous constitution had been made by a different government from a different, headed by a different political party, and it was skewed in the direction of that party, and they wanted to make one skewed in the direction of their own party. And in both of them, by the way, the Tamils weren't very much involved. The result is a lot of civil war and 25-year civil war in Sri Lanka with the Tamil rebellion. And had they made the constitution in a different way, they might not have the Tamil rebellion might not have occurred. It could have been averted. And they tried again, by the way, after an election that brought to power a much more moderate government that was willing to make a constitution with the participation of the Tamils. This is in 2015, which is about 6 years after the defeat of the Tamil Tigers insurgency. So you see a lot of different ways in which a new constitution can be triggered at its inception. But usually it is a change of regime is the most common way. And this was, in a certain way, a change of regime because the Rajapaksas, who had been running the country for some years, were denied re-election. And the result was that this new regime, which was a coalition between two different Sinhalese parties, but which took in Tamils to the process, was willing to make a constitution that accommodated the Tamils. And they came very close to doing it. The trouble is that they took too long, partly because of public participation at the beginning that consumed a lot of time, and partly because they had some disagreements toward the end of the time before elections. And as elections were coming, some members of the Rajapaksas party thought the Rajapaksas would be back and that they couldn't afford, therefore, to make the concessions to the Tamils that the Rajapaksas wouldn't be agreeable to. And so they defected from the process because it was getting too close to elections. It's a very bad idea to make constitutions very close to elections, because then the regime that's thought to be favored to be incoming will have disproportionate influence in the outcome. And it did in that
Yeah,
case.
that makes sense. How long does it typically take until the whole process is over?
It depends on what kind of process you have. If you have the usual process where you and I get together and we can agree on a bunch of compromises, you want so and so and I want such and such, we can get that done in 3, 4, 5, 6 months. But if you want a really good constitutional process, it should take a couple of years. And I'll tell you why. Look, there are three standards of decision in constitutional processes. If you want to agree upon a whole set of provisions to be incorporated in the Constitution, we can decide that this is an important decision. It's not a routine decision, not like making a new law about something or other. And so we need a supermajority standard, let's say 2/3 vote of the body making it. By the way, there's now pretty wide agreement that body should be elected. And I agree completely that it should be elected. I can say much more about how, if you like. But
Please do, and please do now.
yeah, well, no, but I want to. Let me
Okay,
backtrack to
sorry.
that.
Okay.
I want to say that there are three different ways in which you can decide on these provisions. One is supermajority vote. Another way is to say, wait a minute, let's not vote yet. Let's see if we can't compromise. You want A, I want B. I'll give you A if you give me B. Or alternatively, we both want something along the XY axis, but your position on the X axis is close to X and my position is close to Y. Let's meet somewhere in the middle. We want the same thing, sort of, but in different quantities. Let's just agree in the middle. And those are two different forms of compromise. I mean, if you see what I mean. One is the
Mm.
compromise of incommensurables, two different values that you want this and I want that. The other is compromise on commensurables, but different points on the spectrum. Sorry for the complexity, but that's another way we can compromise. Okay.
Hmm.
Now, notice two things about those two ways of deciding. If we do it by supermajority vote, the people who lose in the vote are already discontented. Is it a good idea to start out a new democracy with a discontented minority? And I don't mean
Right.
necessarily an ethnic minority. So supermajority vote sounds good because it's a big decision and you don't want to just decide by 50% plus one. But do you really want to decide by 67% or even by 80%? What happens when the 20% goes back home and says, we lost? Do we like this Constitution? No. What happens when we go out on the streets and protest or when we throw stones at those who produce the Constitution? You see that this is not a good way. A compromise is not too good either. You know why? Yeah, everybody will walk away happy at first. But then it turns out that you wanted A and I wanted B, and I said you can have A if I get B, but B turns out in the end to be less valuable than A. And then I'm unhappy, you're happy because you got what you wanted and it's good. I'm unhappy because I got what I wanted and it's not so good. So if the returns from the compromise are uneven, again you have dissatisfied people. And I can give you examples of all of these. Um, let me give you a quick one. In Malaysia in the 1950s, when they became independent, they agreed on a compromise constitution. This was an ethnically divided country in a very big way, about 50-50 in those days. Malays and non-Malays. Non-Malays were Chinese and Indians, descendants of immigrants from 100 years earlier. Um, the Malays wanted certain provisions, and the Chinese and Indians needed citizenship. So they were willing to give quite a lot for citizenship and for some language rights. Down the road, the Malays didn't get what they thought they had bargained for, and they became discontented, or at least their elites did, and they began to deny the import of the compromises, and they began to want something more. Um, I can tell you in a little bit more detail. There's an article in that Constitution called Article 153, which provides for the special position of the Malays and the legitimate interests of the non-Malays. That was to be a very balanced provision, giving the Malays just a few things that the non-Malays wouldn't have. Well, when the Malays realized that those few things weren't helping them to get a lot richer and the non-Malays were richer, they said, oh, no, no, we need a lot more than that. And so they amended the Constitution. First of all, they gerrymandered the constituencies so that they would have more power in the legislature. And then they amended the Constitution to favor themselves. And they now say there are some Malays, a lot of them actually, including politicians, who say that Article 153 is not a balanced provision. On the contrary, it provides for Ketuanan Melayu, which means Malay supremacy. So you see that compromises can often work out very badly for the total product, and that's a perfect example of one such way. So okay, Horowitz, you've now said you don't like supermajority voting, you don't like compromises. What is it you really want? Well, I don't want to disregard supermajority voting if it becomes necessary, and I don't want to disregard compromises if they become necessary, but I have a hierarchy. I want consensus. Consensus is when you and I don't agree to exchange some goods with each other as in compromise, and we don't agree that we're going to produce this document by some supermajority vote. Rather, we're going to agree on provisions that constitute a way forward for both of us in conducting politics in the future. That's consensus. Consensus means that we agree, not that we're compromising because we don't agree, but we agree on a compromise which is second best. No, we agree on the first best, the way forward to conduct politics in the future. And that brings me to those 7 cases. Um, there are 3 constitutions that stand out as being consensus documents. One, which is a little weaker than the other 2, is the Constitution of India, which has survived now for quite a long time. It was much longer than anything in the book on the endurance of national constitutions would have guessed. That constitution was formulated between 1949 and 1952, and it's still in force with a lot of amendments, to be sure. But generally speaking, it was made by consensus. Yes, they took some votes at the end, but they were lopsidedly in favor of the provisions, almost unanimous. The second one, and I'm going to give you 2 that are really quite contemporary, is the Indonesian constitution that was finished between 1999 and 2002 after the fall of Suharto. Indonesia had in those days quite a large secular camp. The largest number of seats, but not a majority, was held by a secular nationalist party, not an Islamic party, although Islam is the religion of about 89% of Indonesians. Excuse me. Um, it also had a couple of Islamist parties, which didn't quite, well, it depends on the election, but they don't really anymore add up to much more than 10% of the vote. And it has a lot of parties that reach out to Muslims that aren't really Islamic. They're secular parties, but they take account of Islamic interests very heavily. Um, so at the outset, the secular nationalists were quite skeptical of the Islamic parties and those that reached out to Muslims, and vice versa. That is, there was some idea that the secular nationalists could dominate the proceedings with a plurality instead of a majority. There was a lot of suspicion. But suspicion was eventually allayed by a process. I can't go into it now; it'd take too much time. But a process that essentially quieted the rebellion in the streets, because there was quite a big rebellion in the streets, a pro-democracy rebellion among young people especially. And some of those people had been shot by the army. And there was great fear that the army could manipulate the secular nationalists to come back into control directly or indirectly. And eventually a method was found to quiet things in the streets and also to agree that this would be truly a civilian government. And then they sat down and they said, how are we going to decide this? And they said, well, let's just wait till everybody agrees. And they had some provisions that they couldn't agree on for quite a long time. For example, Megawati Sukarno Putri, that's Sukarno's daughter, not Suharto's, but Sukarno, the earlier dictator's daughter, was the
Okay.
leader of the secular nationalist party. And she took a very long time deciding that actually the Constitution should provide for the direct election of the president. The presidents had been elected by a sort of a super legislature, and in fact dictated by the regime. um, so she thought it would be okay to have democratic nominations, but she also thought that maybe the process of actual selecting the president should be done indirectly by this body.
Mm.
And it took her a long time to come around. And until she came around, they just didn't decide this question. They did provide in an early amendment that there would be democratic participation in the nomination of candidates. But then they didn't provide for any way, one way or the other, to decide who would be president until finally she came around. That was years later. She came around and they said, okay, we're all agreed now. And that was the last step in the consensus building process. And there isn't anybody now who disputes the direct election of the presidency in Indonesia. And as a matter of fact, there's hardly anybody who disputes any provision in the Constitution of Indonesia, because they decided everything by consensus,
Uh,
despite their polarized beginning point.
so if I got that right, they just waited her out and she actually changed her opinion.
Yes, yes.
But
Actually,
why?
she had
Why
been
did she? But why
because
did
she
she
was
therefore change her opinion?
because she was I know I can tell you the story in great detail, but I will avoid doing that for the sake of time. But she was thinking that there were elements of her own party that were so loyal to the old way of doing things that this was the one thing on which she dare not deviate. And then it turned out that those elements in the party, she was persuaded by other elements in the party who were inclined toward direct election, were relatively few and far between. And basically, within her party, there was a very large consensus in favor of direct election that she wasn't quite tuned into. And they persuaded her. So,
Hmm.
so notice the kind, we have double consensus. We had a consensus within her party that formed, and we had consensus in every one of the other parties, and we had a consensus across all parties and all factions.
Hmm.
And that is the way consensus works. And consensus isn't complete unanimity. If you want a totally unanimous decision making, you have then empowered spoilers, because anybody can stand up and say, I don't agree, and then I will stop the adoption of this provision. You can't have that. So consensus doesn't mean perfect unanimity. It means a very heavy level of agreement, a high level of agreement across all the major factions or groups. And that's what they had in Indonesia for everything, with one very small exception that a small provision that was very poorly prepared and has been misinterpreted to some degree. But not everything in the world is perfect. But this is a very substantial improvement on the previous constitution, which was a dictatorial constitution. And by the way, just to show the people who were attached to the old constitution that the new constitution wasn't disrespecting them, they still call it the 1945 Constitution of the Republic of Indonesia, whereas in fact, 87% of the words are different. It's a new constitution, masquerading in the form of the old. Now, I can tell you more briefly why the same thing happened in Tunisia, because this is the same story. Uh,
I would like to ask you a
sure.
question that kind of leads us maybe there. Um, now this is you just said this is basically a new constitution because it adapted in a way so much. Uh, what would you say makes a good constitution? If it is some rules that stay for a long time and hold true for a long time and don't get changed, or if it is actually able to adapt to a new situation or a new world?
No, both are true. That is to say, the core of the Constitution should prove subsequently to be apt for the predicament of the people who made it and the people who have to exercise power under it and be subject to it, uh, the people who have rights under it. Uh, it also, however, has to make provision for amendments that are reasonable under, but not such easy amendments. Amendments should be hard to make, maybe not as hard as they are under the American Constitution, but they should be relatively hard to make. And the Constitution should be full. That is to say, you shouldn't have blank provisions. The Iraq Constitution of 2003 promised that there would be an upper house, but they couldn't decide how the upper house would be populated. They couldn't decide how to elect members of the upper house. So they left the provision blank and they said it will be filled in due course. Now that's 2003. It's now 21 years later and it's never been filled in. So that's not a good constitution. And it's not a good constitution on many different grounds. Okay. Um, so, and its process was terrifically defective. Its process was defective because it left out the Sunnis were essentially left out of the election for the assembly that was to draft the Constitution, um, and and the result was the Shia and the Kurds, without the participation of the Sunnis and without the participation of smaller minorities, pretty much made the Constitution that suited them, that suited their own interests. Um, but look, it should take care of all the problems. It shouldn't say, okay, wait, we have to, they could have gotten a 6 month extension of time. The Americans said, please don't get that because we need to show that you're making progress. Not show the Americans that you're making progress, but show the Iraqis
Mm-hmm.
because things had turned rather bad by that time. We need to show the Iraqi public you're making progress. Don't get the extension. So they didn't. And the result is that there's this empty provision for an upper house. That's a rather important provision not to be filled. And likewise, there's some ambiguity in the revenue sharing provisions from oil. So there are a lot of things wrong with that constitution because they didn't have time. The Indonesian constitution took the best part of 3 years to finish. And the Tunisian one took 2.5 or something. I can't remember. The Indian one took 3 years. But the ones that come out very quickly are likely to be defective in some way or another. There are a lot of shortcuts that will have been taken, and the shortcuts count. They matter because you need, in my view, inclusion, deliberation, and consensus. Inclusion, because you should have election by an electoral system that is designed to include all of the major and even most of the minor uh, subdivisions of the population, whether those are ethnic or regional or class or what have you, or political party. Everybody should be represented in the body by election. And we know that inclusion is the one criterion that is shown to be conducive to democratic outcomes. Nothing else has been shown statistically to be conducive to democratic outcomes. But I'd be willing to bet that if we divided constitutions up by amount of deliberation, that deliberation would also be shown to be conducive to democratic outcomes. And I'd also be willing to bet if we could get a large enough sample of consensus-based constitutions, that consensus would be shown to be um, conducive to democratic outcomes. Um, as of now, all I can do is make what I think is a pretty good argument for that. I don't think I can say definitively that I can prove it. And
Mm,
my argument also depends not merely on Tunisia, which also had a more extreme version of the same polarization as Indonesia. It had a serious Islamist party, and it had very skeptical secular representation. They hated each other at the outset, and they just took their time. And they had a lot of failures along the way, and they also had a consensus committee to produce consensus where consensus had been failing. They also took a lot of time out in the middle to see if they couldn't then get back to work cooperatively, which they eventually did. And and their constitution also passed. They also took votes at the end. The Indonesians took 0 votes really on this. They took a vote on something else, but not on this. Uh, the the Tunisians took um, votes, and the votes were all in the 85, 90, 95% range, maybe close to 100 in some cases, because they had reached consensus about the way forward. And part of the reason is that the Islamist party was led by a man named Rashid Ghannouchi, who had spent his exile and the exile with a number of his colleagues in London, where he became attached to the British parliamentary system.
mm,
And he said, "That's what I want. I want a parliamentary democracy." They said, "Ah, we don't trust you. You're going to have you're the largest party in this constitution making body." Their party had gotten 43% of the representatives in the constitution making body through elections, and we think therefore you're going to use the parliamentary majority. Or you'll co-opt some people to the majority, and you'll run the place as a dictatorship. We don't want that. We want a separation of powers. We want a president, democratically elected. Well, Ghannouchi was so keen on democracy that he said, "Okay, I agree. We'll have a parliamentary we'll have a presidential system instead of a parliamentary democracy." But unfortunately, the system they chose for the election of the president was a terrible system in their circumstances. They had multiple candidates. And in the first round, the candidate who won the first round won with 13% of the vote because there were so many candidates who
mm.
got 10%, 8%, 6%, and so on, to add up to 100. And so they had to have a second round because they adopted the French runoff system for where you need a majority, not just a plurality. And the 13% guy got 51% of the second round, more or less. So, and by the way, there's been a coup made by that president against the Constitution. But
Uh,
the, but he's approved by exactly 12% of the population in surveys. So uh, don't tell me that it came out badly because a coup was made against it. No, no, the population still likes the Constitution, and it was
are
made
there
the same way by consensus, by constant talking back and forth, by a deliberative process.
to talk more general and not specific about one country? Are there certain topics that should be or need to be addressed in a constitution? Like for example, the voting system. I would assume uh, for each country should be addressed in the constitution approximately. And
Yes, the
what
only
other things
problem,
are there?
yeah, well, the electoral system should be, but isn't always in the Constitution.
It's not.
It's sometimes in statutes, rather than in laws made afterwards, rather than in the Constitution. But yes, I think it should
Oh,
be. But bear in mind, if it works out badly, uh, it's going to be hard to amend the Constitution. So I feel a little ambivalent about that. I'm all in favor of the correct electoral system, and I have my own systems that I prefer for most countries that are ethnically divided, at least. Uh,
yes.
but but other things are definitely the division of power between the legislature and the executive. Judicial review is now a favorite. As I said, a lot of the organizations that send people around to advise on constitution making don't really care about what the provisions are. They're actually disproportionately influenced by by some books written by a former professor of mine, Roger Fisher, called Getting to Yes. You've heard of these?
Yes, I heard of a book.
Yes, this is about negotiating, and
Yeah.
Roger Fisher's view was that people who disagree should agree on any yes they can get to. I think this is a deep fallacy because a lot of yeses that we could agree to will have very bad consequences. Um, so getting to yes is not the ultimate aim of a constitution process. Getting to the right yes is, and that's where consensus comes in, and that's where negotiation takes a backseat to consensus, and supermajority voting takes a backseat to negotiation. But you have those as fallbacks, as I say, because you sometimes you can't get everything by consensus. There are some standard provisions that everybody thinks should be in a constitution, or many people think should be in a constitution. But if you ask them why, they'd, they'd say, well, most constitutions have them. And so you see that circular reasoning.
Mm.
um, you can have deviant provisions in constitutions if they're well thought through.
But how can you like I think what should be critical, or what I would assume at least, is that you focus on the main core principles, and even though there might be some laws or amendments you could agree upon, but if they're just temporarily important, they shouldn't be in the constitution, right? So how do you choose what should be in the constitution and what should just be a, I would say, basic law?
Well, you first of all have to agree that the Constitution has to have different powers for different functions: legislative, executive, judicial. I think that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
How those bodies are chosen and what their exact powers should be, that's a different question. A lot of that has to do with tradition in the country. Sometimes traditions are informative. Sometimes they're dysfunctional and you should disregard them and discard and throw them out. But sometimes they're actually informative. That you have this tradition for a reason. If you look at the Constitution of Switzerland, you will see that Switzerland has its provisions because of the way Switzerland was composed. That is to say, by the addition over time and over long periods of time of new cantons to the federation. And so the cantons have to have a lot of power, and they do have a lot of power. Um, Switzerland also has a tradition of popular referendum, direct democracy. Well, suppose we decide that Switzerland needs a new constitution and we advocate the end of direct democracy. Nobody needs referendum. We don't have referenda in most countries for most purposes. Um, well, I think the Swiss would say, "Well, wait a minute. I think that's part of democratic government. It's part of direct democracy because Switzerland is a country um, which could very well end up being very divided between French language speakers and German speakers and Italian speakers, and therefore the way in which we build our country is through certain majoritarian processes like referenda, which transcend linguistic divisions. If I'm supporting a referendum, I won't care if the majority consists of, and let's say I'm a German speaker, I won't care if the majority consists overwhelmingly of German speakers or overwhelmingly of French speakers, as long as I get my majority. And so the result is that people campaign for referenda across linguistic lines. So if we were to
Mm.
get rid of referenda, one of the props of linguistic harmony would be eliminated because that majoritarian tendency supports linguistic harmony, if you follow what I mean. That is,
Mm. Yeah, I think I do. I hope.
yeah, members of minority groups feel equal in their votes. My
Mm.
vote's as valuable as yours, even if I'm a French speaker and I'm in a minority.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
uh, so uh, uh, tradition is sometimes very informative. There are a lot of different ways of thinking about it. The Nigerian. Let me come back to the Nigerian provision that I started out with. The Nigerians decided that to be elected president, you had to have this territorial distribution in addition to a plurality victory. That is to say, you had to have 25% of the vote and no fewer than 2/3 of the states. The Indonesians liked that idea, By the way, oddly enough, I was in Indonesia when they were thinking about it, and I said, "Wait a minute, I was there when this thing was devised. Let me tell you why." Uh, and and it took a long time for Indonesia to borrow something from Nigeria, as you can imagine, because the Indonesians don't know anything about Africa, and therefore it took a lot of convincing. There was a civil society group that was pushing for this, but then when they formulated the provision, it made it too easy to be elected president. It was really, as long as there are only two candidates for president, it was inevitable that in Indonesia they would meet the territorial distribution requirement because it wasn't the same as the Nigerian one. The Nigerian one's more strict. Likewise, in Kenya, they adopted the same thing, but they watered it down. So um, they're thinking this is a good provision, but wait, we don't want to make it too stringent. So the result is it's ineffective. um, this happens a lot, and if there's a lot of borrowing, the borrowing will be, wait a minute, let's just change it a little bit. And once we change it a little bit, sometimes it becomes completely ineffective.
Is the Nigerian constitution that you help with or consulted with, is it still the one that is active today? That is in
That's a
place?
complicated question you've asked because there was actually a coup made against that by the military 4 years later. And
Mhm.
military, so that's 1979. Then in 1983, there was a military coup, I think on New Year's Eve of 1984. Um, and the military stayed in power until 1999 in that iteration of it. But in the 1999 Constitution closely parallels the 1979 Constitution, and it has the exact same provision for the election of the president.
But I asked because I think I saw, I actually have the page open right now. The Nigerian constitution, I think, is the second longest by word count of all constitutions in the world, just after India, which has like triple the amount of
Yes.
words. Would you say, or can one say that word count or length is a parameter for judging if a constitution is good or not so good? I
No,
would assume a simpler constitution is a better one, right?
I don't think either is the case. I think everything depends on how apt the provisions are for the situation that the country confronts. Um, but I definitely don't think longer is necessarily better. Um, why do we have longer constitutions? This has been studied, by the way, by a person named Ross Dixon in Australia. And
Hmm.
what Ross concluded was that you draft long constitutions when you don't trust the judges who are going to interpret it. So in India,
Okay.
they inherited some British appointed judges, and they said, "Whoops, let's nail this one down and be dead sure that
Yeah.
that we're going to get what we want." And that's why the Constitution of India is so long. It's been amended many, many times. By the way, India has some special problems that require amendment again and again and again. For example, some territories that are now part of India, like Goa and Sikkim, were not
Hmm.
and Nagaland, were not necessarily parts of India in 1947. So when they acceded to India, or in the case of Goa, were invaded and became part of India, Goa having been a Portuguese colony, special amendments had to be made for their accession, and special provisions were made in some cases. So the Sikkim one is particularly outrageous, actually, but it was there. The previous ruler of Sikkim managed to get a state uh, 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 legislative body elected according to a, a provision that favored his own ethnic group. Two groups actually that supported him, and disfavored a very large group that didn't support him. And eventually that came to the Supreme Court of India, which in a divided vote finally said, okay, it's legitimate because it was negotiated as part of the Constitution. But ordinarily we would not regard this as a legitimate provision for one of our states. But in Sikkim, it was a legitimate one. So, I mean, they have a lot of special problems in India having to do with caste, having to do with preferences for members of particular castes, both the so-called scheduled castes, who are the ex-untouchables, and the OBCs, the other backward castes, who maybe in some cases are actually not so backward, but they realize that they can get some privileges by pretending to be backward. And the courts have had to confine those privileges to some reasonable number, as opposed to allowing them to run riot. So India's constitution has a lot of problems of implementation, but but it's survived very nicely, actually, on the whole. But it's long for the reasons that I've mentioned to you.
Yes.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure why the Nigerian one is so long. There were, of course, British judges sitting in Nigeria at the time of independence, but by 1999, there weren't British judges anymore. And Nigeria's judiciary is not at all bad. It's pretty good. It's quite faithful to the Constitution. I've read recently. I've been reading quite a lot of Nigerian cases, and if you come from a common law country like Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the U.S., or Ghana, or India, or Sri Lanka, or Malaysia, you can read the Nigerian cases very easily. They're all in English, and they're very simple to understand once you understand the provision being litigated. And the Indian cases are quite faithful to the Constitution on the whole.
If the length of if the length of the Constitution and also time of existence, I mean, you said the American Constitution might be a little too hard, at least for your liking. If length and time of existence don't indicate whether a constitution is good or not so good, is there any other indicator that at least could show in tendency what constitutions are better formed for their existing citizenship or not, or citizens?
I can't think of a single indicator. Okay, I can't think of a single indicator. But I'd like to go back to the process of drafting. A constitution that's been drafted by a political party or by an assembly that has an overwhelming majority of a political party and has been adopted by a majority vote is likely to be really a bad constitution. And so that
Okay.
that it's likely to be biased in favor of that party.
So
But
the process might show whether or not a constitution.
well, that's my view. I keep coming back to
Yeah.
that. Actually, I think the ones that are better tend to be drafted by a better process, and it's what you hope for anyway. If the process and the results don't have some um, uh, relationship to each other, some positive relationship to each other, something's very badly wrong.
Yeah. Uh, you know what I was wondering? Before the podcast, actually, I I was googling if whether or not the word capitalism or the topic of capitalism is in the American or the U.S. Constitution, and Google told me that actually not even the word is in there. And I was curious since I thought constitutions are about the core principles, and I would assume that would be a core principle of the U.S. Do you happen to
Well,
know why that is?
uh, oh, sure, because the word capitalism didn't wasn't invented in 1787.
Okay,
Um,
that's a
you,
basic answer.
yeah, you understand that in 1786, Adam Smith's book, which endorsed essentially principles of capitalism, was published. So it's just at the same time as the Constitution. But even, you know, I'm not sure if the word capitalism appears in Smith's book. I'm just not positive.
Hmm.
But there is a provision in the U.S. Constitution about commerce, and because the U.S. Constitution was drafted to replace the Articles of Confederation, which were a very, very weak and decentralized formula for organizing the U.S. government. And it had no central legislature and no central executive. It just had committees interstate committees to govern, and was very, very ineffective. And they had tariffs against each other's goods. So if you were living in Maryland, which happens to be the state in which I now live, and you wanted to export something to Delaware, which is next door, Delaware could tax it. So and have a tariff against it, as if Delaware were a separate country. And so they understood very well that this was dysfunctional to economic development. That was pretty clever of them, actually, at that stage of the game. And so they put in a clause for requiring the freedom of interstate commerce. That the Commerce Clause turns out to be one of the keystones of the American Constitution, because it authorizes the central legislature to do a zillion things, as interpreted, to facilitate interstate commerce. And the facilitation of commerce was regarded as one of the principal objectives of having a constitution in the first place. So that's as close as you get to capitalism, I think. But but it's pretty close. Commerce and capitalism are, yeah, it's
Yeah.
not quite synonymous, but pretty close.
But you said for your liking at least the U.S. Constitution is a little too strict in when it comes to adaptability
Well,
of itself.
because of
What?
the amendment process is very difficult. The amendment
Yes,
process.
and what I would like to ask you is, do you have a favorite? I would assume it is set as an amendment or a favorite idea at least of how a constitution should be able to adapt itself, to change itself.
Well, there are two different ways. One is by explicit amendment, and the other is by change outside the amendment process. That is to say, the meaning of the words can change over time. And if you have a
Yes, but
constitution,
what by what requirements
by what method? Do you
or
mean by what
method?
method? Yes. Well, in the United States, it's the power of the Supreme Court, of course, uh, and of the courts in general, the federal courts in general, to declare that some act of Congress is unconstitutional. And so, what they would have declared in 1803 when the first case came down with respect to judicial review, it's a famous case called Marbury against Madison, in which the first Chief Justice, John Marshall, um, declared that the Supreme Court and the federal courts had the power to review acts of Congress and acts of the executive. Actually, at that time, more acts of the executive for their constitutionality, their conformity to the Constitution. Um, the things that we would think of today as constitutionally required weren't necessarily constitutionally required in those days. So it's a very good fortune that the courts, the federal courts of the United States, have the ability to declare certain practices inconsistent with the Constitution and others consistent with the Constitution, because it makes up in large measure for the inability of the amendment process to cure all defects in the Constitution, which reveal themselves over time.
Hmm. I think what I meant is what do you think is your favorite or the best way or laws that can change a constitution? Under what requirements it can be
I
changed?
haven't got a best way because I think it all depends on the country. Um, in a country without judicial review, the Constitution should be more liberally amendable than in one which has judicial review. Um,
Oh,
but
okay.
so again, look, I want to say one more time that I think the test of a good Constitution in the end is not just the process by which it was adopted, though I think that's a very good part of the test, but whether it is apt for the circumstances of the country for which it is intended. And a lot of constitutions aren't. A lot of constitutions are provide dictatorships in countries that are dying to get freedom and
Mm,
recognition of rights. Look at the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring suggested that quite large fractions of Arab populations really wanted liberal democracy. How many got it? The Tunisians got it briefly, and now they're mired in a ridiculous dictatorship that's bound eventually to fall, because eventually the Tunisian public just won't take it. Um, it's taking it temporarily because it had a bad experience with the first governments after the constitution making, because they were unable to solve the economic problems of the country. But eventually, I think Tunisia is not likely to be a candidate for long term dictatorship. But that's what I mean by apt for the country that in which it has to function. And the
mm,
best way to tell what that is to have elected representatives and to give them lots of time to deliberate, and to see if they can reach consensus. So I'm back right to my original starting point. You see, but I mean, let me give you some examples of constitutions that are not done that way. Um, in Nepal, they adopted a new constitution in 2015. And they had been going back and forth about what kind of federalism they wanted. They knew they wanted federalism, but they had big disputes about what kind of federalism they wanted. And they finally got together, and by majority vote, they adopted a constitution that was opposed by 30% of the population living in the lowland regions abutting India. If you know the shape of Nepal, it's a long rectangle, and the bottom part of it consists of not entirely, but consists disproportionately of two groups, the Madashi and the Taru, who together are about more than 30% of the population. Their interests were neglected in the original constitution that was adopted, because it was adopted by there had been an earthquake in Nepal, and there was a need to have a new government very fast, and so they got together and they said, okay, we're going to adopt this constitution. We're 2/3 done with it. Let's just finish it up, and that's it. And the part that didn't get finished to the satisfaction of those people living in the South really affected them in a bad way. And so this constitution produced months of violence afterwards, because it was adopted in a rush by a process that was really foolish, because they were well on their way to something good. Uh, I mean, I could go on and on and on. I can give you, a half dozen of these examples of stupid constitutions. In Iraq, it was the let me give you one, what I call a rent-seeking constitution. You know what rent-seeking is, of course. Rent for the viewers. Rent-seeking is the desire to obtain unearned financial benefits. So um, the leading Shiite party at the time of the Iraq Constitution was a party that was strong in the south of Iraq, where there are a lot of Shiites, but it wasn't strong in the particular province of Basra. They call their provinces governorates, but so I'll call them provinces. But in Basra, Basra, that party was not strong at all. There were other parties that had the majority of the council there, but that's where the oil is, in and around Basra. So this party said, what are we going to do about this? We want to control the oil. This is the source of the wealth in this country. And the Kurds wanted regional autonomy. The Kurds always want regional autonomy because they always feel like strangers in Arab countries, and in Turkey as well, because they're treated as strangers. They're a minority that crosses country lines. So the Kurds and the Shiites got together and said, the Kurds don't reside in just one province. They reside in two or three. They said, we can create a federal constitution where provinces are the units, but you can amalgamate provinces to form regions. So the Shiites said, what a good idea. We can amalgamate Basra, where we're a minority, with provinces in which we're a majority, and to form a region in which we'll be the majority. That's a great idea. We'll control the oil. And the Kurds said, yeah, it's a wonderful idea, because we can then govern all of the north of Iraq. Perfect. And the two of them forgot that there's a Sunni minority. The Sunnis were kept out of this because the Sunnis weren't even sure that Iraq should be a federal country, and they certainly weren't sure that you could amalgamate provinces to form regions that would have some efficacy, because the Sunnis are heavy majorities in some provinces, but in some regions that could be part of that configuration, they wouldn't be such heavy majorities. It wasn't in their interest. So this was made by two groups of the three major groups in the country, and then there are many minor groups whose interests were completely ignored. Does it stand to reason, therefore, that the Sunnis were unhappy with this constitution? They were. They were
Of course.
excluded from it, basically. They were excluded from the deliberations. And you know what they did? They got the people who had not turned in their rifles to the army, and they had an insurrection during the time of the American occupation. And to this day, now the Shiites rule Iraq. Luckily for them, they don't really need federalism anymore, because the Shiites are a majority in the country. The Kurds are the apostles of federalism these days, but the Constitution allows the Kurds to have a region if they want to. So this is constitutional failure because of the process. And as I said, a lot of the provisions they can't agree on, and they still can't. Years afterwards, many decades afterwards, actually. I can
So yeah,
proliferate.
so it comes back down to the basic process. That's what she said was what is
Yeah,
basically
yeah,
the most important
yeah.
thing. That it's how to judge it.
If the
Yes.
Sunnis were there in the deliberations, they would have said, no, we can't have this. So we can't have a consensus. If consensus were the guidepost, the Sunnis would say, no, it's no consensus as far as I'm concerned. And they would have
I
had to
think
go back.
I think I've heard that I think Israel is the country with the most changes in constitution. I'm not sure if that is correct. I would have to look that up again. Maybe you know it. Um,
Israel?
Israel, is it?
No,
I think it has a
Israel.
lot. It had a lot
No,
of
Israel
changes in the
has
constitution.
no written constitution,
Okay, then it was some other country. Then
and
I'm
neither
wrong about
and
that.
neither does Britain.
Neither does Britain.
Correct. Britain has a Bill of Rights, but it doesn't have a written constitution. But
Okay,
Britain
but
has such strong customary traditions that it doesn't quite need a written constitution. But it did feel that it needed a Bill of Rights and a Supreme Court, which it now has.
what has Israel instead of a constitution?
Well, this is a disputed proposition in Israel now. Because they're fighting over judicial review. You know, before the war in Gaza, there was a very big dispute going on in Israel with crowds in the streets, millions of people in the streets about judicial, well, hundreds of thousands anyway, about judicial review. Israel has a very activist judiciary with the power to declare certain things to be contrary to the basic laws. And basic laws are certain laws that were identified by the Supreme Court early on as being fundamental to the organization of the state and to the rights of the people. And then later on were actually designated by the Israeli legislature as basic laws, so they have a superior status to ordinary laws. And there are various judicial doctrines that have evolved around this notion of what's a basic law and so on. And some of the religious parties don't really like the judicial activism of the Supreme Court because it tends to produce more secular than religious outcomes. So there's big dispute about how the Supreme Court should be selected. And about what its powers ought to be. And once the war is over in Gaza, whenever that may happen, they'll be back to that dispute. And actually, you asked me about consultancy. Well, I've done some consulting for them on this. Not the Israeli government, but people who are proponents of a constituent assembly to produce a new constitution.
But isn't that in itself extremely interesting that there are democratic countries that don't have a constitution, so it might not be a requirement. The constitution might not be necessary to say.
Well, but if they have, in both cases, they have a functional equivalent of a constitution. That is to say, they have, in the British case, strong traditions, and in the Israeli case, less strong traditions, but a judiciary that has taken to elucidating the provisions of what a constitution would ordinarily be in Israel. Now,
There was
they could be wrong about this. Look, well, hang on. Let me just say one thing. Um, this doesn't seem so strange to American lawyers. Why? Because a lot of American law is just common law. That is, common law is the law that emanates from judicial decisions, and originally emanated from, back in England in the Middle Ages, emanated from common traditions. So therefore, to American eyes, this seems, it seems deviant. Yes, that's true, but it doesn't seem impossible. It seems possible in a common law country like Britain, and Britain is, of course, the original common law country, to survive without writing everything down on paper. Now, Israel was a new country, so it didn't have, and it had big differences in the population. I'm not talking about Jews and Arabs. I mean, among the Jewish population, it had many different countries of origin, many different religious traditions, and so on. So it was a little harder to make it work. It's been harder to make it work in Israel. But if you're interested in that, there is a woman who's written a book on Israel's non-constitutional constitution. Her name is
that
Hannah
is
Lerner.
called.
No, I can't remember what it's called, but you can find her easily. Her name is Hannah Lerner, Lerner, and she is the head of social sciences at Tel Aviv University.
Well, I will look that up. For me, that was an extremely interesting fact. I would, in regards to your time, I would like to move over to our second segment, which are some rapid fire questions, just a few. And to make them really rapid fire, I would like to ask you to answer them in round about 2 to 3 sentences
Sure,
max, if that is
I'll
possible.
try.
Okay, note some of these are more personal or about your opinions, just so that you know. Are you ready? Would you say that you are ready?
Yes, ready.
Okay, okay. Um, if you had a big billboard, let's say on Times Square, everybody would see it. What would you put on it?
I suppose I'd put on it the title of my most popular book, Ethnic Groups in Conflict.
It's a good advertisement. Do you have a favorite quote?
Do you know I have several favorite quotes and I can't think of any of them on the spot?
That's no problem. We could just
I'll
go
tell you.
into the
I'll
next
tell
question.
you, however, what I tell my grandchildren:
Yeah, please.
write if you get work, if not, hang by your thumbs.
Okay, yeah, that's
Let me tell you why
that's
I
good.
tell it to them. It comes from two radio comedians of many decades ago by the name of Bob and Ray,
Okay.
and they were absurdists. So everything they did was designed to show how crazy people are. And so they had a parody of a soap opera called The Life and Loves of Linda Lovely. They had a foreign correspondent named Wally Ballou. Come in, Wally, and then because they had primitive radios, they said, Wally, where are you reporting from? "Oh, I'm out here, and you couldn't hear anything. So they were parodying the mainstream radio programs, including the advice programs. So, right if you get work, if not, hang by your thumbs. That was well, right if you get work came out of the depression where work was very hard to find. You see,
Yeah, that's good.
but I tell my
I like that
grandchildren
analogy as
all
well.
the time. They will always remember that. You can use that
uh,
on your children.
I will. I will. I will when I have them. What's your newest, biggest insight?
Oh, that's really interesting.
So some of them, these are maybe questions that are a little bit harder to answer, and you can think for a few seconds if you want. Um,
Well, I have a new book coming out from Oxford University Press called Federalism, Regional Autonomy, and Ethnic Conflict, and it turns out that in devising federal systems, people pay a lot of attention to the relationship between the central government and the federal units, but they forget to pay attention to what's going to happen inside the federal units. And the result is in Asia and Africa, quite a lot of countries have um, ethnic subordination where there's more than one group in a given federal unit. And then the courts have to sort it out, and the courts haven't done a very good job with respect to that. So that's a major theme in the book. So that's if you call that a significant insight, well, okay, but
yeah,
maybe it's not.
I would.
It,
I
it's
would.
uh, it's it's an insight at some level. Whether how highly significant it is, I don't know.
A controversial opinion. I believe what almost nobody else does.
Do you know? I don't think I have such an opinion. I think I have opinions that are in this stream on this question, on that stream, on that question, but I don't think I have them. An insight that a controversial opinion that nobody else has had. I will tell you, however, that I have not voted for Donald Trump or for either of his opponents in previous elections. I cast my vote for somebody who is not a third party candidate. I vote for my wife consistently as for president.
Huh.
I think
That's,
she'd make a better president than either Donald Trump or Joe Biden.
I would assume I don't know her, but I can assume
Well,
that.
that's a controversial opinion that no one else has, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Um, what would you have liked to know when you started? Let's say kind of a message to your 20-year-old self.
That I have because I'm actually giving some lectures in England in the next few weeks, and it's one thing that I am going to emphasize. I didn't realize when I started out because I was in graduate school in Soviet politics originally, and then I shifted to this ethnic politics thing. I didn't realize how much more insight you get from multiple countries than you can get from any single country. And I also didn't realize how much more insight you can get from multiple disciplines: psychology, law, political science, sociology, uh, and so on, than you can from any given discipline. So I'm talking to a group of advanced graduate students and junior faculty at the University of Exeter in England within the next few weeks, and I intend to hammer that theme home very hard, because a lot of my work has psychology at the root of it. A lot of it also has well, I just told you that in the book on federalism, there's a lot of law in it, and I was trained both as a lawyer and as a political scientist. So that's an obvious one for me. But I've used quite a lot of social psychology. I have a book on ethnic riots in which I use quite a lot of social psychology, and also in that book, Ethnic Groups in Conflict, there's a different fraction of social psychology is used. So I
So
urge
basically, be open in a way.
open
That's
to multiple disciplines. I mean, that means that you have to cross a disciplinary boundary and understand something about the other discipline. You can't just borrow it ignorantly.
yeah, multidisciplinary approach. Um, what's Oh, you probably already answered it within the podcast, but what do you think is the biggest problem in the constitutional formation process?
The biggest problem is people who go as advisors without having any advice about what the actual process should be. They have advice about public participation. They have their own notions about what provisions should be in the Constitution, but they have no legitimate idea of the process by which a good Constitution can or should be produced. That's yes, that's a theme of these proceedings that we've just been through, and it's one I believe in quite sincerely. I've taken a lot of criticism for that, by the way. You can imagine that the people who like public participation have really hammered this this theme.
Of course,
They're wedded to the idea in a very big way, but they can't prove
of course.
that it serves any useful purpose.
Do you have a favorite constitution? Meaning one that to your that maybe perfectly has done the process that you like, or just a favorite constitution. It doesn't necessarily have to be the best constitution in your opinion, but one that you like.
No, I don't play favorites that way. I have to say, I have to be, I have to be willing to be critical of some things, and I'm even critical of some things in the one thing in the Tunisian constitution, and another thing in the Indonesian constitution. So, and several things in the Indian one.
Of course, and you can be critical, but what I mean is that one that you maybe like to read, for example, or
Oh
like to
no,
think about.
reading constitutions is much too hard. You have to think about what the real meaning is.
Okay, okay. Then the last question: how would you spend $1 billion to make the world a better place? So this doesn't have to necessarily be anything in regards to constitutions, but in general, how would you spend $1 billion to make the world a better place?
It would have to have something to do with education, in my view, but I don't know exactly what. And $1 billion in the world as it is today won't go very far. So I think I'd rather hang on to the $1 billion.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Donald Horowitz. Your book, I will link it down in the description for anybody who wants to know more about you and your ideas, constitutional processes and a democratic commitment. And yeah, like I said, thank you very much for taking the time. It was really interesting.
It was for me too. Thank you.